So the topic that I want to speak with you about today is, let's call it the pillar of reason. So the house of Islam, there are many, it's a very large house, but one of the most important supports for this house is reason, meaning the use of consideration, thought, and knowledge, which is often absent. And more than ever today, it's something we're thinking about. And so the way I would like to introduce it to you is from the Sufi perspective about the place, the important place of reason. We already know the important place of surrender, or of mystical annihilation, and so forth. But this pillar is one of the most important pillars in the house of Islam, supporting the structure of Islam. And all we have to do, in fact, is to consider God's statement, since earlier we were talking about the angels, and the angels' relationship, say, to the human being. They have, of course, great perspective, purity, power, as we find out in the story of Badr that we were speaking of. But in this story that we see at the beginning of Surah Baqarah is the situation of Adam. And God is replying to the protestation of the angels. And they say, will you put a creature in this earth who will create mischief, etc. And God has certain knowledge about Adam, and he proves it to the angels, but he explains it to us for this topic that we're doing tonight, that we're looking at tonight, where he says, Allama Adama Ismul Husna Kullaha. You know this verse, very famous verse. So here God is saying, he's using the root of ilm, knowledge, but in a verbal form, saying that I taught, meaning I gave knowledge of the names of all of the things that the angels, with all of their height and holiness, they did not know the names of these things. And he's proving to the angels that there's something about Adam that is special. This is just the beginning, where we find out that Adam has a particular place. But one of the first things that we see in this statement, very early in Quran, really kind of almost at the beginning, so we can understand the context of the Quran, revelation, etc., is that revelation will involve the speech of God. For example, kalam. It will involve the inherent wisdom of God, you see? And it will be contextualized in other verses of Quran, but here we are in a situation that actually Adam is not yet on this earth. Adam is in a state where it is outside of time, you could say. And the angels are seeing that God is going to put this creature, which they see as being, they see that he is made of the earth, but this earth that he is made of is the sacred earth of that is fermented in God's hand, he says, in the Hadith. So this is not yet the earth that he descends to. This is a very special place that is one of the domains. Some people say Olam Misal, and other people say just in this other domain. In any case, this leads Shabastari to write the following line at the very beginning of Gulshan Raz. He says that Adam shod padid as aql tamyiz ki ta danesh as on asli hama chiz. That Adam shod padid as aql tamyiz ki ta danesh as on asli hama chiz. And so I've translated this. This is from the corrected manuscript, because there's, as usual, several manuscripts, and Mubahed's manuscript is the one I'm using. Discernment manifested in Adam through reason, so that he might come to know the source of all things. So Shabastari has here, this is some of the very first lines of Gulshan Raz. In the name of the one who inspired the soul to contemplate, who kindled the lamp of the heart with the light of spirit, the two worlds were illumined by his favor. Through his bounty, Adam's clay was a garden of flowers. The powerful one, in a wink of the eye, with the letters forming B, made to appear both of the worlds. When the P of his power breathed onto the pen, thousands of images filled the tablet of non-being. From that breath, the two worlds came into existence. From that very breath appeared the soul of Adam. Discernment manifested in Adam through reason, so that he might come to know the source of all things. So this is the very beginning of Gulshan Raz. And we see the stress here is on the importance of aql and the importance of what could be derived from aql, which is tamyiz, discernment. You understand, huh? To distinguish between what is right and wrong, distinguish between things. So in this commentary, we see he's talking about he says, Chun Maksud as Ijad. Here we're looking at Lahiji's commentary on Shabastari's lines. Chun Maksud as Ijad Mawjudat Kainat Ma'arifat wa Shanaktan Hazrat Mawjadas Ta'ala wa Taqadas. چنانچه در حدیث قدسی که کنتو کنزن مخفیان فاحببتو ان عرف فخلقت الحلقه لکی عرف هست. و در کتاب کریم جلت عظمته می‌فرماید که و ما خلقت الجن والانس الا لیعبدونی. سلطان مفسرین ابن عباس تفسیر لیعبدون و لیعرفون یعنی لیعبدونی و لیعرفونی فرموده موافق حدیث قدسی که گذشت باید دانستن که لیعبدون گفتن و اراده لیعرفون کردن بنابر نقطه‌ای خواهد بود و آن نقطه در این محل آن است که عرفان و دو طریق میسر است. یکی به طریق استدلال از اثر و مؤثر و از فعل و صفت و از صفات و ذات و این مخصوص علماست. و دوم به طریق تصفیه باطن و تخلیه سر از غیر و تجلیه روح و این طریق معرفت خاصه انبیا و اولیاء و عرفاست. So he's saying in this, this is Lahiji now, and he's looking at this, he's contemplating what does this pillar of reason and knowledge, what is it made of? And the first thing he wants to draw the attention to God's statement about being known, that he wanted to be known, you see. God wanted to be known. So he says, if we translate, he says, because the intention of the creation of all of the creatures of the universe and creation, the intention was the knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, and the direct awareness and the direct knowing of the presence of the Creator, Most High, as has been stated in the sacred hadith, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. And I created this creation and the creation of Adam, in other words, Khalqa, so that I would be known. And in the sacred book of the Quran, God says, and I did not create the jinn or the human except to worship me. And the king of the people who elucidate the Quran, Ibn Abbas, when he did his elucidation of liyabudun, to worship me, meaning I did not create them except to worship me, he said that this meant to know me, except to know me. Meaning I did not create especially the human, except to know me. That's what to worship me meant. And this is actually, for your information, this would be one of the first cases of ta'wil that you would think would be thought of as bid'ah, but in fact it's in the time of Ibn Abbas, and so he would have been one of the Salaf. And so he goes on to say, and we can see the relationship of this elucidation of Ibn Abbas to the sacred hadith that was just quoted. It should therefore be understood that to speak of, in order that the human worship me, and to show its meaning that the human being should know me, this concerns, or this was done for the sake of a subtlety, a spiritual subtlety, which he had wished to make, meaning Ibn Abbas. And that subtlety, that spiritual meaning, is that in this place, meaning in this sentence and so forth, and its interpretation, that gnosis, meaning knowledge of the spiritual, it can happen in two ways. It's possible in two ways. The first way is by way of logic. You see, dalil. So istidlal is to looking for the logic. And this is going from the effect to the cause of that effect. And it is going from the action that we see in the world to the quality that leads to that particular kind of action. And it moves from the qualities, meaning especially the divine qualities, to the essence. And this is the specialty of the theologians. And the second manner for arriving at this knowledge is by purifying the internal aspect of the person and by emptying the spiritual center, the core of the person, from what is other than God, and of polishing and illuminating the spirit. And these are called this is the way of marifat. This is the way of spiritual knowledge. And this is the specialty of the prophets and of the saints and of the Gnostics. Okay? So this is where he ends this discourse, this particular statement. And so already we see in Shabbos story, we see joined throughout Gulshan-e-Raz the element of knowledge, the element of even using logic, which they actually learned from the Greek thinkers. To when we think about the science of knowing, they attribute it to what they encountered from the philosophers who derived their knowledge from the Peripatetic philosophers, meaning Aristotle and his descendants and so forth. And this is fascinating because very often people think there's going to be a problem between logic and faith, or some problem between logic and Sufism. See, either it concerns believers who are suspicious of logic because they think it's associated with godless philosophy, or it's the Sufis who tend to stress surrender and annihilation, and so we rarely hear from them about the use of logic. But don't forget that Shabbos is from the Shafi'i, from this line going back to Al-Ghazali. Was Al-Ghazali interested in this topic at all? Do you know? He was very interested because he even wrote a book against the philosophers, right? And on the other hand, so he wrote a book called The Refutation of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Philosopha. So he wrote this book, but actually he wrote many interesting books that on the surface they look like one thing, but in fact they're more complicated. So he really wasn't against all philosophy. He wrote a book that is worth our consideration. Can we consider that Al-Ghazali comes before Shabbos story? So if we're going to look some more at Shabbos story, we might want to consider. He wrote a book called Faisal al-Tafriqa Bain al-Islam wa Zandaqa. So this, I would say the meaning for this would be like the determination of distinction between Islam and heresy. So you would think it sounds like a mean book, right? It's gonna like cross off everybody's name except Shafi'i and his own team. And it's exactly not what that book is about. The very interesting thing about that book is that, in fact, like today, the house of Islam is cracking and is falling in on itself because of hatred between the different groups of religious people. And if you read the Faisal, you will see that Al-Ghazali, step by step, he presents a case that the only way to save the house of Islam is through Burhan. Burhan means, again, logic and reason, we would say. So his case is entirely based on that. And the case he makes is that most of the problem in his time, it had to do with this emerging culture of interpretation. And so you had a conflict between the Mu'tazili and Hanbali. It's this period of time following this where you have a great tension between the strict Hanbali attitude towards the scripture that you should not interpret or question it. And you may know that the Mu'tazili approach was that you have very liberal interpretation, and like we were talking earlier about the angels and so forth, for them, they don't need to be real angels, they can just be mental capacities or whatever. So there's like this, suddenly this huge rift between the different schools, each one of them falling somewhere in between, and fights, killing, wars, all because of this. Over in Afghanistan, for example, there's, who are the Karamiya? Have you heard of the Karamiya? Anybody? No. So this in Afghanistan, this group emerges. They are very much like the Hanbali, but they are extremely strict, and they're wars. There's wars. The Karamiya coming, and if the Nishapur is one place where a lot of this fighting eventually manifests, and all of this fighting, unfortunately, it leads the people of Nishapur to open the gates of Nishapur to the Mongols. So it leads to treason, you see, because there are some people, they say to the Mongols, we will open the door so you can kill those people. And the Mongols just, of course, killed everybody. So, but once they got in. But this is a very relevant topic for today, but we have to understand that Shabastari, he is very much influenced by Al-Ghazali and the writings of Al-Ghazali, and he would have been very aware of this situation. And so he argues throughout the Faisal Tafriqa Bain al-Islam wa Zandaqa, he argues for tolerance and allowing the different sects and mazhabs to hold their views and not rush to judgment. So in his case, we should at least review that he explains that there are several levels of existence, and therefore there are several levels of interpretation. And I've talked about this with you before, have I not? A little bit. So the first level that he gives is zati, which means essential, but he really means the thing in of itself, meaning the thing as it actually is. So like as it actually is, this is where you would always start with Quranic verse. You would say, we read Battle of Badr, there's angels, And I said to you, I accept, did I say that I accept what it said literally? Is that correct? Yes. Because I do. I accept that this is possible. And I accept, but if someone else said to me, no, it's not real angels. These were some other faculties or something. If I'm following what Al-Ghazali says, I should have some tolerance and I should say, fine. So we'll look at these other levels. But the first level is as it is explained, meaning as it naturally is. Okay? And he says, if you cannot, if it still doesn't make sense, you go to another level. So another level, the next level, is Hesi. It's the senses. But he means specifically, when we read the Faisal, we see that the language of the Faisal, it remains very much about seeing. Meaning when he says the senses, he doesn't mean through touch. He means through seeing that could be construed as being conceptualizing to some extent, but primarily he means seeing. How do we know that? Because he gives an example. He says, if I have a stick that has a coal, that I burn the end, it has a coal, a bright charcoal on it, see? That is as it actually is. But if I move it around, it can make a circle. And that is Hesi. So in other words, the stick and the coal, sparkler we could say, is what it is. It's just what it is. But if you move it around, it still is what it is, but it appears to the Hes, to the senses, to the perceptions, to actually be making a line. And it is not actually making a line. So he gives that as an example. Okay? And so he also gives as an example the hadith where the Prophet says, heaven manifested to me within these walls. So the Prophet is evidently, peace be upon him, in a room, and he's claiming that heaven showed itself to him. This is in hadith, okay? And some people say, well, how could that be literally true? Because heaven is a vast concept, and within these walls is a narrow concept. And so for Al-Ghazali, logic forces you to go from zati, from as it is, to Hesi, to the senses. Because he points out that you could see the sky in a mirror, for example, even though the sky is much bigger than the mirror. See, so he gives that as an example to prove it. Okay? And so the next level of interpretation that Al-Ghazali accepts, because he says these are all levels of wujud. So I think we agree there's a level of wujud, meaning of existence, which we would call as it is, nature as it is. There's our senses, the way our senses take in nature, for example, and this would be the level of the senses. It's not actually true, and psychologists have proven it's not true, meaning what nature actually is and what our senses believe that nature is for anything around us. You can read about that. That's all been proven since that time. This is exactly right. The next level is the level he calls khiyali. So we would say at the level of image, you see that it forms an image of some kind, that you accept that this is we could say a metaphor, a kind of, but in this case it's not a metaphor of meaning, it's a metaphor of actually an image, where it is a visual, it's at the level of a visual representation of something, of the imagination. And as you know, the level of the imagination is natural to the human being, because the human being is able to imagine, like I could close my eyes and I could imagine a herd of elephants coming through this room. Even though there's no herd of elephants here. You see what I'm saying? So this is what he means by the imagination. He doesn't necessarily mean like the olam misal, because if we take what he explains in the Faisal, he doesn't talk about the olam misal. He simply talks about the human capacity for imagination. And he says, therefore, consider which verses in the Quran or in Hadith would we apply this to. He says the verses, a lot of them that you would apply it to is where the prophet says it was as if such and such. You see, there are verses like that where clearly he means that it happened as if such and such a thing happened. So he gives that as an example. The next level, he says it's akli. You see, so akl here he means what we're talking about a little bit here. We would say in English the noetic, meaning the quality of abstraction would be another way we could say it. So when we hear that God says he becomes angry, Al-Ghazali says anger requires a body, it has a heart, the blood, the person's face turns red, they're pumping blood, and they become angry, and this cannot be what happens to God because God is above this. So he says that in some of those verses, they can be interpreted to mean that they are in a like manner, you see, in a like manner. And he gives an example. He says, for example, this ruby is worth more than say 20 horses. You see? Or say he says actually this ruby is equal to 20 horses. And it is not equal to 20 horses, it's only equal in an abstract fashion. So these are the kind of examples he gives in, if you want to, you can read this beautiful book that is relevant, I think very relevant to today. So we've just done 4 levels. And the last level is we would say in English analogous, which is coming from shabahat to shabahi. So it means it's analogous. It's like, it resembles something. How when something resembles something else? That's shabahat. So he says in those, there's some verses where there's purposely, because there's some resemblance of terms, some resemblance of ideas, that you can move to this level of shabahi. So remember that the Hanbali is more likely to accept the first level. And Al-Ghazali says, by using Burhan, because throughout the Faisal, because the Faisal, what does Faisal mean? What does it mean? In Arabic, what's Faisal mean? Faisal, what does Faisal mean?
Faisal Akadha?
Yes, it means it's something like either a decision or a ruling. Yes? And Faisala means to take an action of some kind based on that, right? But Faisal, so that we could also, therefore, we could name the book, he wrote a book called A Ruling on the Distinction Between Islam and Heresy. So it was intended to be a decisive explanation. You see, a clear explanation. And so he is adamant. He's adamant. If you read it, it's a very strong book because he's very worried about Islam. He's worried it's collapsing. Not from enemies outside, from inside it's collapsing. It's collapsing because if somebody disagrees with you, you think you will kill them. And he's saying no. He says anybody who believes that they are right and no one else is right, they are a heretic because that means they believe there are prophets. They believe that they have no fault in the same way that prophets, they have no fault in terms of the revelation. You see? So he gives that comparison. He says if the person is going to say that absolutely they are right, they are most likely the person closest to heresy. He says because they should be willing to use these 5 levels. They should have tolerance with these 5 levels of interpretation. And he says all of this takes place through istidlal, because I'm coming back to Shabastari, as you can see. Because you see how, so Shabastari gets his Sufism through Ibn Arabi, but also through Al-Ghazali. And, but I'm giving you like a background, like Shabastari lives after the Mongol invasion. And the world is destroyed. Afghanistan, you know, Khwarazm, Iran, all of it destroyed pretty much. And now the Ilkhanid, the descendants of the Mongols, they are now Muslims. And they're in Tabriz. But he is aware of all of these books about Islam. Shabastari is, but we have to remember that some of the very great thinkers have already lived. Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Al-Ghazali, these people have already lived and passed away. Huh? And, but I hope you see the wisdom of what he was trying to do. He was saying that it is not okay to use your opinion. He said you have to use burhan, which is a kind of logic, and it's a stylistic logic. It has rules, and he says you cannot just make it up as you go along. But then, astonishingly, he admits that even in burhan and dalil, it may be that people are using different rules. Now, this reminds me of lawyers in a courtroom a little bit. They're all using the law, but they're able to prove that somehow their case is right. I'm not saying for good reasons, I'm just saying that you could compare it to that. So there's a thing called legalism, using the law. But lawyers, we see they use it very freely, right? They make the case for their own case. That's why you have a Supreme Court. You have to go up to the Supreme Court, and even they then maybe change their mind 10 years later. So it's very clear that even Burhan, in the same book, Ghazali admits that it varies. So he's even giving more room for tolerance. See, what I'm saying is that he was in favor of tolerance. And the way you have tolerance is you allow people, so he says, if somebody interprets a Quranic verse in any of these domains, you have no right to call them heretic. So you asked this question about the angels, and let's say that you said to me, oh, this is ridiculous. I don't accept that they were actual angels. I think they were the forces, like the actual powers of God, let's say. I have no right to object, because I would say, yes, in the 5 ways of interpretation, this could be more than one. It could either be akli, it could be certainly in the domain of or you could say to me, no, what you saw is hesi, really. What you're saying is that it says what they saw, but it wasn't what was there. You see what I mean?
Right.
So there could be, because we could understand, when we understand how Ghazali's thinking, we could see how let's say I didn't believe that these were actual angels. Then I should allow that people believe they're actual angels, because I would allow for this domain of hesi, and that's what the people saw. That's what the Quran says. That's what the people saw. It says right there in the verse, am I right? So if that's what the people saw, how much more close to hesi can you get, based on Al-Ghazali's statement? Agreed? So it could either be either zati or hesi. And what if somebody accepted neither of those, and they said, no, this is just a way that God is alluding to something else? And we would say, well, what do you mean? And they come up with whatever they come up with. What was Ghazali concerned about? Like, is it really a tafriqa bain al-Islam wa zannaka? If it really is a distinguishing, then surely there has to be some teeth to it somewhere. And the teeth for Al-Ghazali is very simple. He says the infidel is someone who says that the Prophet is a liar. Meaning, they are a person who rejects all 5 of those levels, and instead they say this is just not true. That the Prophet, peace be upon him, made this up. And that's where Ghazali draws his line in the sand. He says, whoever says the Prophet is a liar, this is infidel, zindiq. So that's, in case you're wondering, because after all, if you're saying it's the difference between Islam and heresy, you have to, somewhere you have to draw some distinction, right? But do you see what I mean? He leaves this huge domain. This is what I mean about the pillar of reason. Reason means istidlal and burhan. It also means ilm. But this pillar is what held up the house of Islam for 1,000 years. And only recently again is it eroded. This is the pillar. You read the book, you will see it's a very important book for Muslims to know about. Huh? And it's in English, you can get it. Sadly, I think the book, I've never bought the book, but the book is like $300 or something, because it's like one of these scholarly books. Huh? But you can find passages of it quoted here and there, and you can also just get the original Arabic text if you want to, and follow the Arabic text to see what it says. So my point tonight is that there's a very important element called reason that used to be a pillar, meaning a fundamental tenet of Islam, and that pillar is being ignored by a lot of different parties in today's world, and it's led to a huge amount of violence. Just like in Al-Ghazali's time, there was a huge amount of violence, and continued to be a huge amount of violence all the way through the Mongol invasion. And you could even say the Mongol invasion was as successful as it was because of the fighting in the house of Islam. Nevertheless, I say for 1,000 years, because there were many periods when there was peace. So it preserved the house just as often as it was not able to preserve the peace. So